so crowded an agenda for this year. It's going to be about the leadership. It's going to be about the order of the world. It's going to be a lot of bilateral challenging meetings. What exactly to be the focus of this year? I'm struggling with it. Mr. Posen, from the American perspective, share with us.
Well, from the United States perspective, as opposed to the Trump administration perspective, the hope is that Chancellor Merkel, President Xi, and the other G20 leaders can contain Mr. Trump and that they can ignore most of his random rants. In terms of the agenda, the Trump administration is basically trying to push ahead on getting concessions in steel trade, which affects China, but also Europe and others like India, and trying to ignore the fact that the rest of the world wants them to do constructive actions on climate change, as many Americans want them to.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think, Mr. Gros, from the European policy perspective, I guess?
Yes, in Europe, the concern is more damage limitation. How can we bring this summit behind us without too much damage to European and transatlantic relations, especially, as Adam mentioned, in the area of trade and of climate change. And all the efforts are being made to bring Mr. Trump to sign something which he doesn't really believe. Mm-hmm. And we'll know in a few days whether that can be achieved.
Interesting. To contain, damage control, or limitation. Very interesting phrases you guys used. What about you? I'm also joined now from Hamburg at the G20 venue. Probably you could also hear the background noise over there. Axel Berger, who is the head of the G20 Policy Research Group of the German Development Institute. Mr. Berger, you've got a lot of work to do, I have to say, in the next 2 days. But what do you think it will be the major task for everyone at this G20?
Well, hello from Hamburg. I think this summit is about preserving the multilateral system we have, trying to avoid any damage that is being done by the current US administration. So a positive scenario from the summit could be that G19 comes together and move things forward in the climate area, on trade, but also on issues like cooperation with Africa. Mm-hmm. So this could be the most positive scenario I could think of because of the challenge we have from Washington.
I see. Mr. Yuan, you've heard your colleagues from different parts of the world talking about their hope. What is likely to be China's hope?
Yeah, it's a very good combination from almost all the major powers in the world. From Chinese perspective, I remember it was George W. Bush who initiated the first round of G20 Summit. So the United States had played a very leading role at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. But now, this time, because of Trump, anti-globalization, anti-free trade, I'm afraid because of his presence, and this year's G20 will be very hard to be focused on very single issue like free trade, like globalization, will be diversified by different issues, even by different sidelines of the G20. So it's very hard to focus this year.
Can we afford so many diversities in terms of what each other's purpose is for this meeting? Mr. Posen, can we afford a failure, the rest of the world to reach a deal, like the word being used by President Trump? Mr. Posen?
I think the issue is the vacuum. I think the issue is the vacuum that the Trump administration leaves on both trade and climate. And this is not going to be settled in this one meeting. Can they get a rallying around the axis of Xi and Merkel and possibly Macron in support of the system is the key question. I think they can take first steps in that direction.
Interesting. Some G20 members, in fact, are already taking their steps, for example, leaving out the US in signing on to new free trade agreement. Merkel has been firm in saying that anyone who believes that the problems of this world can be solved with isolationism and protectionism are making a terrible error, despite of the fact she had a beautiful handshake this time with President Trump. Japan will sign a free trade agreement also with the EU, indicating the free trading world will, if necessary, work around the US, some suggest. So let's go to Mr. Berger. Do you think that will happen? And also, do you think the rise of Germany as the leader, at least for this meeting, will help to solve some of the problems?
Could you please repeat your question?
The question is, do you think other parties, if cannot reaching a deal with the United States represented by the Trump administration, will be able to work around the US and come up with their own options? And during this process, what's likely to be the role of Germany?
Well, Germany obviously this year in the G20 process plays a key role. Germany chairs the G20. Germany has an important role in defining what is being discussed. The German Chancellor has a huge experience. She was there in 2008 when the G20 was uplifted to the leaders level. So I think Germany plays a key role here, and I think there are also a lot of expectations from the world towards Germany to play such a role of a very responsible global leader.
Mr. Gros, will Germany be strong enough for now, be able to fill in the vacuum, as Mr. Posen mentioned earlier, left by the United States in terms of world leader, and particularly, at least, for this G20?
No. Germany can give the appearance of being very strong now and pushing, at least according to many people, in the right direction. But Germany is just too small to lead the world. Germany is a very small part of the global economy. It is actually also a relatively small part of the European economy. And actually Germany is a bit in a strange situation. When Trump threatens protectionist measures, Germany says, yes, but the EU decides about this. And now Merkel preaches free trade. She should let her EU colleagues talk about that. And the same thing goes for the environment. That is in principle also a common European policy. So I think it would be very good for Merkel if she became a little bit more modest and she emphasized much more that Germany is part of the European Union and that actually the European Union should rather speak with one voice than a German voice.
You know, Mr. Yuan, as we talk about, this is complicated. You got transatlantic relationship over there. You also got the relationship within the European Union as well. And you also got China and US relations at the same time. What is likely to be China's role? Just before you provide us with the answer, President Xi Jinping, during a multilateral meeting with other BRICS economy, you know, the new emerging economies, he talked about, on the eve of the G20, this free trade order of the world. He talked about globalization. He talked about multipolar world. He said all of these are the principles that have to be hugging to, you know, for the G20 Summit this time. Is China's role going to be a leadership role this time?
I don't think China will play a leadership role, but can play some kind of leading role. After America left the vacuum to this G20, I don't think any single country can replace of the United States play a leadership role. I still remember the former President Obama, his last visit is to Germany, and it seems that the banner of free world was delivered from the States to Germany. But it's very hard to imagine that Merkel can play the leading role in the G20, even if she's hosting the G20. The same case that China can play some leading role, but it's also very hard to play a leadership role. So in the future,
why is it hard for China to play a leadership role from the Chinese perspective?
Because still China is a developing powers, the regional power with a global reach, and I know the world is expecting China to play bigger role. We want to play some leading and responsible role, but given the capacity and the intention, I think in the future in G20, the ideal situation is that Germany, China, Russia, and other countries, including the United States, play some collective leading role. This is what China, expect. That's multipolarization, and China this time we can play our leading role
in that regard.
In that regard, yes.
Mr. Posen really have something to say. Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think to build on what my colleagues have just said, the goal has to be less about it being just China or the EU or Germany being designated the next leader. The goal has to be, as both President Xi and Chancellor Merkel have said, the maintenance of a rules-based open trading system, of a rules-based common effort on climate change. And so it's not so much about the leadership. It would be natural for them to support the system. And then if President Trump, or for that matter, President Putin, doesn't live up to the obligations of the system, it's up to China and the EU, and frankly, Japan and Canada, to stand up and say, we won't allow that. And they have to be isolated. The EU and China, and they have to work with Canada and Japan if possible, have to be prepared to make Trump and Putin see the error of their ways.
But Mr. Posen, there are things that really need to be interpreted well. President Trump, whether you like him or not, he is the US president and he represents the country. He talked about the fair trade. The others talk about the free trade. So there has to be a fundamental interpretation. What is fair trade and what is free trade? As a result of this rule base, we have to know what the rules are, the interpretations are. Do you think there's likely to be fierce debate about that this time? Mr. Posen, briefly.
No, but you're giving the Trump idea too much credit. Just because he uses this term fair trade doesn't mean there's any validity to it. It's the rules, we know what the rules are. There are some places to work them out, like on carbon taxes, like on China market economy status. But fundamentally, we know what the rules are. And so the issue is to make the US live up to its obligations. You don't have to indulge him. If he doesn't want to play, it'll hurt my country. But Trump is not forever. Make him go home and learn that he can't play on his own.
I know, Mr. Posen, who are you going to vote for 3 years from now? But, we are still having some time. So, Mr. Berger, what do you think?
Well, I think obviously it's needed that these middle powers like Germany, like Canada, like Japan, come together and try to cooperate on key issues like trade, like climate, and other things. But I think we should also acknowledge that a lot of other cooperative things are going on at the same time. Just think about the situation when President Trump announced that they would step out of the Paris Agreement. The day after, or immediately after, a couple of US states got together and said, no, we still think the Paris Agreement is a very important frame for us. We would like to continue to address climate change.
So your point is, Mr.
So
Berger,
do a number of cities around the world, NGOs, companies.
So, Mr. Berger, your point is,
we should also look at these developments, not only at the
administration. I see your point. Mr. Yuan,
my point is that...
yeah, we got some delay over there, but I got your point, Mr. Berger. We're going to come back to you later. Mr. Yuan, your point here.
Sorry.
When President Trump mentioned about fair trade, it implied means that it seems it's unfair to the United States, the current trade system. But it's unfair to say this because this trade system was established by the states and some Western powers. And today, when some rising power getting much more prosperous and much stronger, and the Americans feel unfair to them. So when he mentioned fair trade, it seems it's a double standard. So this the critical issue for this G20 meeting is that how to make every country back to the free trade and globalization on the right track. But because of the trans-Pacific relations, I mean U.S. and China relations in the tipping point, because of transatlantic relations in trouble, and because of U.S.-Russian relations, in a very big problem. So I'm afraid that the sidelines, I mean the bilateral talks and the mini-lateral talks, will offset the G20 meeting. So how can this G20 meeting achieve some positive outcome? Still, we'll have to wait and see.
Right. Not to mention there are a lot of also demonstrators outside. It would be no exception. Any G20 summit, there will be demonstrators outside against the globalization. There are a lot of mixed messages going on all over that area in the city of Hamburg. But what about that, Mr. Gros? Do you think some of the bilateral meetings and bilateral flashpoints, in a way, would steal away the attention of the G20 or divert the G20 general agenda to some of the very branched issues?
No, actually, I think that some of the bilateral meetings, at least, could be very useful, because that would be a way to work around Trump and his antiques, one must say. And in the meantime, one should not exaggerate. The United States is still not a protectionist country. Trump has changed very little. He has talked a lot, but changed very little. In Europe, nothing has changed so far. So I would say for the time being, the rules of the game are there. And the question is just whether the United States signs a piece of paper where they say, yes, we like these rules. So is it worthwhile to spend a lot of effort on that? I would say perhaps we should rather try to get our leaders to meet perhaps without the President of the United States, and then work on the real issues, which is climate change, which has to be preserved, and maybe free trade among all the others.
All right, I see. Mr. Posen, I know you're not a friend to President Trump, but if you could provide some advice to all the other foreign leaders there trying to persuade President Trump to get on board, what are some of the secretive weapons or useful tools do you think that others could use?
Well, it's not so much I'm not a fan of President Trump. I'm not a fan of the policies that he is pursuing. If he pursues the right policies, I'm happy to be a fan of him. It's important to recognize that the policies he is pursuing publicly and now threatening to actually do on the trade front, and with the withdrawal from TPP and from the Paris Accord, are completely in contradiction of the last 70 years of American policies by both Republicans and Democrats. And the reason that Republicans and Democrats, of people of both parties, both presidents, throughout this period, didn't do what Trump is doing is because it was against U.S. interests and against the global good. So we can play this game, and there will be an incentive for a Japan or a Saudi Arabia to make bilateral deals with Trump, and that's what he's counting on. That's his belief. He stated this, that if he bullies people in a bilateral context, he thinks he gets a better deal. I don't think the rest of the world needs to wait for that to happen, and to the degree that they can create solidarity, it's important. And the second thing is, my friend Daniel Gros talks about moving on to the big issues, but you either have to decide, as seems to be happening thankfully on climate change, you're going to do these issues without the US for the time being, or you decide you have to get the US out of the way. Either of those are necessary because you're not getting progress on any real issues with the US involved right now.
All right. You have already stated something from your heart and your wonderful brains over there, Mr. Posen. So let me leave the other three, each with one sentence to wrap it up. If this is going to come in history as a successful meeting in the history of G20, what have to be done? One sentence if you can, gentlemen. Let's go to Mr. Berger. You work on this for a long time, so you can come up with one brief sentence about that.
Well, I think Hamburg should send a strong message that despite the United States, despite the policies of Trump, the other G19 countries got together and promoted international cooperation and multilateralism.
All right, Mr. Gros, your turn.
That's exactly the point. The others have to get together and show Donald Trump that he will be weaker if he does not join them.
I see. Mr. Yuan, final words?
In Hamburg G20 Summit, we expect the world will be back to the free trade system, even without the fully participation of the United States.